notes, and it said 3, 8, and 9 at the previous one, and I thought, man, that's a month ago. I must have not, and I had a mark here, but no date by question 14, and I thought, I must have gone further than that, but I couldn't remember. So I called Masako, I called Otto, tried to find out what question I was on, and finally Otto had texted me, and so I called Robin. I said, doesn't seem right. She said, well, March 15th and 16th you were in Kentucky. March 22nd and 23rd you had COVID. And then last week I was at Cape Disappointment with Nathaniel's family. And so here we are. I missed three classes, and I'm going to be here for 3 classes now, so we'll get a good ways. I don't know how far we're going to get through chapter 11. I've got lots of material that I want us to look at as we're going through this. So starting in verse 17, we just got through talking about the how men and women were to be attired when they were praying and prophesying, and what was proper and suggested, actually. And Paul was telling them, before I praise you for remembering me and everything, but now when we get down to verse 17 and down through the end of the chapter, he's talking about the Lord's Supper and some pretty serious abuses of that. And so let's just go ahead and read up through verses 21, and then this question begins with verse 22, and we'll read that as well. Paul said, in the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. Can you imagine that? That your assemblies actually are doing more harm than good? That's such an amazingly disheartening statement. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. No doubt there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat, for as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? Certainly not. So, understanding the situation there that we've talked about in class as well as a sermon recently, we have 2 groups of people in Corinth. We have the well-to-do, the people who own the homes and the houses, and we have those that are the have-nots. They're the poor people. And so we have the haves are gathering on the Lord's Day, on the first day of the week, and they have invited their friends, and they're having a private meal. And then either in conjunction with that or following that, they're having the Lord's Supper without the rest of the congregation there, and especially without the poor people who are all out there in the atrium. They're in there in their own little private room. And so Paul's saying, when you guys, you're not eating the Lord's Supper. It's not the Lord's Supper that you're eating. And so that's the kind of the situation. And so in question 14 says, in light of verses 20 and 21, where he basically sets out what they are doing, why is Paul plainly upset with them in verse 22? Okay? The situation that you just read, go ahead, Mike.
Well, a little earlier when he says, I hear that divisions exist among you, I think that's what he's unhappy about.
Right. Well, and that division, that of all the activities that a church can be involved in, should not be taking place in the observance of the Lord's Supper. Tim?
There's a tone of, you should be able to figure this out.
Oh, absolutely, yes. In fact, as I'm reading this, I'm seeing just Paul filled with indignation. It kind of reminds me of when he confronted Peter in Galatians, the 2nd chapter. I mean, it's the same kind of, I can't believe you're doing this. You know better than this. And there's some irony here, obviously, but the situation prompts Paul to ask 4 rhetorical questions. And basically, I think that they're aimed at and intended to reduce those who are sated, those who are filled, those who are wealthy in this situation, and reduce them to the level of shame that they have inflicted on the people that don't have anything and are sitting out there in the atrium with nothing. They have nothing. And what's the first rhetorical question?
Do you not have houses to eat in?
Right.
Don't you have a house to eat and drink in?
Say that again?
Don't you have a house to eat?
Yeah. And see, you have to, because there's a ton of sarcasm in this. Really, surely it cannot be, can it, that you don't have houses to eat and drink in? And he's referencing their private meals. Don't you have homes where you can host these kinds of things? And intended in that is at another time than this. Yes, John?
I've always gotten the impression from this part of his letter that he's getting on them because they have completely lost focus of their purpose for getting together.
Yeah.
They're coming together for a social meeting, they're coming together to have a party, and they're coming together, they're supposed to be coming together to have a congregational gathering, which is why you have the rich people and you have the poor people all showing up at the same time.
Right.
And now he's saying, do this kind of stuff at home, guys. Remember why you were coming together.
Right.
You lost focus.
Well, and I think that we need to, and we'll bring this up, they're just following the cultural norm that they have had all of their lives with everything else. And so basically Paul is saying, if you don't have homes, then you're excused from doing what you're doing. You're excused from having them in the assembly of the Lord's people if you don't have homes. Well, of course they have homes. In fact, it's their home that they're having this in right now. So if that's not the case, in other words, it's not the case that you don't have homes, then the second question needs to be asked. So there are a progression of rhetorical questions. Either you don't have homes to eat in, and so you're having to do this now, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? Those are the two alternatives. You're either despising God's church, or you don't have a home to have your get-togethers in. And basically in that question, and the second question, Paul really reveals his take on the nature of their behavior, and that's just, it's despicable. Again, that's the only alternative if they have homes in which they can host these. And Paul knows that they're acting like this now because that's the way they've always acted. That's the way they were raised. That's the culture in which they lived. Birth and circumstance in this culture dictated your behavior. They were the social mores. And so you go back to verse 2 where he says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings or the traditions just as I passed on to you. So these keepers of tradition, it's not even supposedly, and I can almost see this, it's not even occurred to them to do it differently. It's just so out of the norm for them that this is normal. It's if we can remember back when we were talking about going to the idol temples and eating the meat, it's the same kind of a cultural event that's just was customarily done, and they just aren't thinking about what's going on. And when he says here, or do you despise the church of God, he's not talking about the poor people. He's not just talking about the poor people. He's talking about the whole community of brethren that make up the church in Corinth, which includes the haves and the have-nots. And he's saying that the church is counting as nothing in your eyes. That's the despise. To despise means to count as nothing. It doesn't mean to hate. It means that you don't even think about it. You don't give it a second thought.
You know, to me, they're like having a potluck. Like, you know, everybody's bringing the food. The rich folks are bringing the food, and the poor people bring little of nothing. And the most of the food is being eaten up by the rich folks,
Right.
and the poor people are getting nothing.
Right.
And they're just having a potluck,
Right.
right in the Lord's house.
Well, and it's not even a potluck, because they haven't invited the poor people to come to that meal. They're not. They're just, while they're there, they're having the Lord's Supper, and the people are coming, and there's no Lord's Supper because they don't have anything to bring with them. And so the mores that they have, the social standards and cultural customs that they have, Paul is saying they are destroying the meaning of the Lord's Supper, which is why he said earlier, when you come together, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper, because you're not eating the Lord's Supper. It's destroying the very unity that supper was intended to proclaim. Listen, when a culture, let me put it this way, no church can endure when old distinctions are allowed to persist. I'm sure that, I don't know, maybe it's still true today, but in the last 50, 60 years, it would have been especially in the South, it would have been a cultural norm that you had black churches and you had white churches, and never the twain would meet. You wouldn't see any interaction between them. And that was just the way it was, and you wouldn't expect it to be any other way. Well, that's wrong. If you allow that kind of prejudice, or we have a Jewish church here and a Gentile church here, we have a free man's church here and a slave man church here, we have the male church over here, and we have a female church over there. Any of those kinds of distinctions that made, or rich or poor, the point is, when Jesus died, he made us one. And we can't allow whatever the culture is saying needs to be the distinctions that are made, those totally have to disappear. That middle wall, whatever it is, of partition, has to be taken down.
This is a bit of a rhetorical question on my part, but what about a church that had a meeting for one group of people and a separate meeting for another group of people, barring, like the Jews meet in this building on Sunday morning at 9, and the Gentiles meet in this building at Sunday morning at 10. I mean, if they were claiming to be the same church, they wouldn't.
No, that's right. They wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I've been places where you had like a Spanish congregation and an English congregation in Southern California. But when they gathered together for the Lord's Supper,
Yeah.
they met as a body, all of them together. When there was preaching or teaching done, they separated because of the language barrier. But coming together to partake of the Lord's Supper, they were all there at the same time. And when the prayers were offered, the person speaking English or Spanish would say a little bit, and then the other person who's translating would translate that same prayer into the language of the rest of the people, so everybody is doing the same thing. When I was in China, and they had songbooks, the first verse was in English, the rest of the verses were all in Chinese. And they were all written out. I sang with them. I knew the words. They're well-known songs, so I just sang the English words that I remembered, and they read the English words and then sang the rest in Chinese. But we were all together, especially in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. So with his final questions here in this last verse, he brings this argument full circle. He says, "What shall I say to you?" Back in chapter 11 and verse 2, he praised them. He thanked them for doing that. And so he asked the second question, shall I praise you in this? And the answer there at the end of verse 22 is certainly not. Or to say it more specifically, I praise you not. Praise you not for that. So any comments? I've got some more to say on this. I just want to see if there's any questions or comments so far. Okay, Randy?
Just two, I mean, probably mentioned Galatians 3, but we're all sons of God through faith.
Right?
And then, as many of you have been baptized into Christ and put on Christ, and there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, you're all
Right.
male or female, you're all one in Christ.
Right?
And then, as you mentioned before, our Great Commission is to make disciples of all nations.
Right?
And so there is no distinction in Christ.
In fact, I was thinking that he said he's going to bring that up in the next chapter, I think, and as he carries on the idea of being one body, and that these distinctions can't exist. Now, if he just asked the first question, if we just had the first question where he says, "Don't you have homes to eat in?" We'd say that Paul was telling the whole church to eat at home and satisfy their appetites. Okay, everybody go there. And that's the way I interpreted this for years. But the second question that he asked there won't allow that interpretation. The first question and second question indicate that the wealthy are the ones that are being addressed here. It's not the whole church. It's just the wealthy. And it implies here ownership compared to those who have nothing. And we point out again their boast there in chapter 11 and verse 2 of keeping the teachings, keeping the traditions. But this kind of segregation by birth or segregation by status, which was what they always had before, which was a way of life for the Greco-Roman culture, Paul is saying those kinds of mores have no place at the Lord's table or around the Lord's table. Did somebody have their hand up there a second ago? Go back to chapter 10, verses 15 through 17. The Lord's Supper is portrayed as being showing unity of the body of Christ. I speak to a sensible people, he says, judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ, and is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we who are many are what? One body. Because we all partake of the one bread. And the practice in Corinth, as we're seeing here in chapter 11, is destroying that unity. It's ignoring it. It's saying it doesn't exist. And by doing that, they were despising the church of God, which, listen, in the Greek, it's a pretty powerful word. It's kataphroneo, and it means to think little of, to scorn, to insult, or disregard. Yes, go ahead.
I'm going to, just share a personal experience here. You were with a group, and there was a member in that group who was hurt by somebody close to us. And as a result of that, our presence made it difficult for them. And this group would partake the Lord's Supper with us, but we would not be invited to events where this person was present to preserve their feelings. And we found ourselves in a place where there was a group that wanted us present on Sundays, but nowhere else.
All right.
And I mean, I can't help but see what Paul is saying here, feel it very personally.
All right.
And not to,
No, it's shaming. I mean, and that's what he's saying. They're despising the church. They're humiliating those who have nothing. And the humiliating here is karahis kono, means to disgrace, to bring shame to. And again, the passage that Randy referred to a minute ago, Galatians 3:28, if that's ignored, there's not a church in the world that can succeed, that will be successful, that will grow and flourish. Yes?
If, let's just say for discussion, that group that came later had enough that they were able to still bring would Paul have said, oh, good, you guys
No.
have already had yours, but these guys, they have enough, so I guess we're okay now. So
Right.
that's why I say, I don't think it's just about the
No.
shooting them. It's the idea that they're dividing, they're
Right.
separating the factions and groups.
Right.
And
That division is just manifesting itself this way. Any kind of division, once you start, I guess there's divisions among you. They shouldn't be. Here's how it's manifesting itself here. Jonathan said, this is how it's manifesting itself there. I mean, anytime there's division, it can be manifested in a lot of different ways. You can have this whole group of people over here that love Dan May and all of these people over here that hate him. You know, we come together and so when I'm starting to preach, this group, they got their Bibles out and the people over here are getting their phones out and they're starting to play games. There's a division. I'm being facetious, but the point is, you can all be under the same roof and not be together. And that seems to be, that's certainly the situation here. And so Paul's answer to that, and let me just kind of lead into this, Paul's answer to that is to remind them of the meaning of the Lord's Supper by telling them what the Lord did when he instituted it. So here, let's go all the way back to the beginning and let's see what was intended, what was meant by it. Any other comments on that? Question 15, what tradition were they not keeping that Paul reminds them of here in verses 23 through 25?
The Lord's Supper.
Okay, yes, exactly. If again, referencing verse 2 and verse 17 and now verse 22, listen, this is a considerable citation of Jesus' words by Paul. I mean, he bringing in what Jesus said and applying it to this situation. And I think that he's repeating this here again because the wealthy in this particular situation have lost touch with what the meaning of the Lord's Supper was. And so Paul is saying, here's the why. Here's why we celebrate the Lord's Supper. And that why goes all the way back to Jesus, and it is to remember him, and it's to remember him in a special way, and to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And their actions and their participation, or the manner in which they're participating in this, is not in keeping with that proclamation. At least not the essence of it. Have you ever wondered how Paul received it? He said, I'll give you what I received from the Lord. Because he wasn't there on the night that it was instituted. I don't know if it was direct revelation. I don't know if it was, he learned it by it being truth. And it's the same truth that he had already received. He passed on to them. He says, I received from the Lord. And so there must be in some way in which Jesus gave him this particular information. And they're not keeping it. And so, again, their meals that they were having was not the Lord's Supper. So what he received, I think, listen, when Paul was there, Paul was in Corinth for how long? You remember? 2 years? Do you think he told them this before?
Once or twice, maybe?
I think he probably did. I delivered it to you. Yes, Tim?
Well, I was just thinking, if he received it directly from the Lord, even still, how much he probably wished he could have been there
Oh, yeah?
instead of where he was and what he was doing at that
Right.
time.
Right. No, I'm sure that you're right about that. So I think Paul delivered it to them, and what they received, they've changed, or they haven't applied it in the correct way. So to the point that what they're doing now isn't the Lord's Supper. I mean, that's how big the change has been. And the Lord's Supper was to celebrate, that we celebrate, is actually from this a continuation of the one that Jesus instituted in that upper room. You've got the elements of the Passover that he's reinterpreting, two of them, the bread and the cup, which then become his body and blood. Both are going to be given the next day on the cross when he instituted it. And he says that the bread became his body. He took the bread, verse 24, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, listen, as you're studying this and you're getting different people's ideas about what all of this is talking about, there are those who believe that the bread actually becomes the body of Christ. It's called transubstantiation. It's the way the Catholic Church views it. That it is actually, it becomes mystically in some way the body and the blood of Christ. Lutherans and other groups refer to it as consubstantiation, so that the substance is there with the bread. The body is there with it. But I don't see that in here, and as we get further along, I think that we'll see that. It refers to his body sacrificed on the altar of the cross. It was broken for you, which I think is a clear reference to Ephesians chapter 53 and verse 12. And basically, his body was a substitute for our bodies. He died in our place. It was done on behalf of us.
I
Randy,
think you meant Isaiah 53.
what did I say?
Ephesians.
I did. I have Isaiah written here. So yeah, Isaiah 53 and verse 12.
So, just a thought, but I think that probably could be construed or come from John 6, where Jesus talks about
Eating his body.
to eat my flesh,
Eat my flesh.
drink my blood, and where many of his disciples left him, and
Right.
because of that, they didn't understand what he was saying.
Right. And I'll just give you my response to John 6 is Jesus said you have to take him into you. You have to imbibe him and take him into your life. Now, when he says we do this in remembrance of him, that doesn't mean just a mental act that we kind of sit here and try to picture Jesus on the cross. You remember any times in the Old Testament where it says, and God remembered his people? Many times. And what did that foretell or portend? Let's just picture the Israelites in Egypt, and they're in bondage, and he remembers his people. Or when they're in Babylonian captivity, or under the Philistines, and it says he remembered his people. What does that indicate, or what does that tell us?
He's about to save.
He's about to act. God is about to do something with that. And so that's when we remember, it's intended to produce in us a preparation to act on it. And so in that sense, it is a memorial. It's a memorial of his death. It's a memorial of our salvation. It's a memorial of his resurrection. And those are all memorials that are headed towards God, which is right and proper. That's part of partaking of the Lord's Supper. But there's also a manward aspect to this memorial. And that is, when is it partaken of? When we're together. And what are we proclaiming?
His death until he comes.
Yeah, our mutual salvation. That we're all a part of this body. We're all partaking of this one bread, and we all have that hope, and we are one body. Yes.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask is, when you look at the word in, verse 26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do proclaim the Lord's death. Kind of in the same way you were just talking about, with God remembering his people. When you proclaim the Lord's death, what does that mean? That you take the bread and the fruit of the vine and you say, okay, he died, and then that's the end of it?
Right, right.
It's everything about what Jesus' purpose was for us.
Right.
We're proclaiming that.
Right, right. And again, and that kind of brings it back to the thing. How many of you do any proclamations when you're by yourself? When you proclaim something, it's being spoken to a lot of people. Okay, it's a proclamation. It goes out to everybody. And so then he talks about the cup became his blood because it was out of his death that this new covenant was ratified. He says, "Do this in remembrance of me," and goes on to say, as often as you drink this cup. It talks of a frequency that's involved, more frequent than just a yearly thing like the annual meal or the Passover was, but a regularly repeated memorial of the Lord's death. And so every time they eat this meal, it's to be done in the Lord's remembrance. It's to be done in a way that honors him while not humiliating others, which is what was going on here. And not humiliating others who happen to be, by the way, equal beneficiaries as you are of his death. What else did Jesus announce at that supper?
Betrayal?
His betrayal. His betrayal and the denial of himself. So it goes back, I received from the Lord on the night he was betrayed. That's the historical setting. And Jesus was ultimately, obviously, placed on the cross by the Romans, but that was made possible because someone betrayed him. And in fact, it happens to be one of his own. And so that's all a part of this message that Paul is bringing into here in this first section. Question 16, what does Paul say is the purpose of this memorial meal according to verse 26? We already talked about it. It's not a new thought.
Proclaim the Lord's death.
Yeah, it's intended to put everything into perspective. It's not because they've forgotten the words of Jesus. It's not because they've abandoned the supper, but because their version of the Lord's Supper that they're doing right now gives the lie to its original intent, which again is why Paul can't praise them. In proclaiming the Lord's death, they're proclaiming the salvation that comes through that death. It's not just an announcement that somebody was crucified. There's more to it behind it than that. And it's not the meal that is the proclamation. It's the verbal proclamation that's made during the meal. This is my body, which is given for you. This is my blood that's poured out for you. And they were failing to acknowledge that. And in fact, they're negating the whole point of the death of Christ when they're excluding their brethren from their fellowship.
And I think just the point of the statement he says, to do this in remembrance of me, is more really important for us to understand. That remembrance is something that we all have been given the commandment
Right.
to not forget. This is important. You remember this. Whenever you do this in remembrance of me.
Right.
I think that's significant.
Right.
What he wanted to say.
Well, and listen, I think so often when we do this in remembrance of him, we think of Jesus for 6 hours in his life, and that's when he was on the cross.
Yeah.
We don't think about his whole life that led up to that was sinless and reaching out and helping and welcoming of people and encouraging them and teaching them and doing so sinlessly.
Yeah.
And remembering the purpose for which he came. Not just who he was, but why he came and what he accomplished in doing that. And again, they're failing to acknowledge that Jesus came to create a new people for his own self, to have a bride. Again, not trying to be redundant here, but a people where there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, rich or poor. And so the death of Christ was not the end, it's actually the beginning of the end. And that's really found there at the end of that verse 26. Until he comes. That's the end. We're before that end. So we're proclaiming it now until the end comes. So when he died, that was the beginning of the end. That's the beginning of the last age, the age to come that we're in. And we proclaim that in the phrase, until he comes. And if you go back to chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, and verse 8, where Paul being, again, a little sarcastic, already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. You have become kings, and that without us. How I wish that you had really had become kings so that we might be kings with you. To the Corinthians, they'd already arrived. They've already arrived. And what Paul is telling them, no, it's still a future. And he's still through this until he comes. So the Lord's Supper is not merely a memorial of Jesus instituting this supper or of Jesus' death. It's also of the salvation that he provided and the community of believers, the church who bear his name. And again, so our vision isn't just inward. We're not just looking at ourselves during this time, but we're also to see outward. Yes?
I mean, I think it's interesting that Jesus was challenged by the ruling class, the Pharisees at the time, for the people that he chose to eat with and spend time with, share meals with, the sinners, the prostitutes,
Right.
the tax collectors.
Right?
And so to partake of a memorial in his name while shunning that very cast of people that he spent so much time with, I mean, that's a pretty... There's two things that can't coincide.
Right,
You can't-
right. And I've said this a number of times, but I think this is critical. If our vision is just inward, if we're just thinking about what God has done for me, and I'm remembering the sacrifice that he made for me, I don't need any of you to be with me when I do that. If that's the totality of what I'm to be thinking about and considering, I can do that at home. But there's also that outward view. And that's what he's going to be talking about here in a little bit, about discerning the body of Christ. It's not the body that's on the cross. It's the body of Christ that's eating the one bread. Any comments on that? Yes?
Well, sometimes I think of it, before I came here, it was always a ritual. We had communion, we received a host, in the church, and we drank out of a real cup that had wine in it. The priest would let everybody drink
Right.
out of the same cup. But now, in what I'm learning in this is, for me, it's actually the one opportunity I have as a human to be united with Christ, to be actually part of him.
Right,
That's how I see it. So it's not a ritual for me anymore.
right,
It's a short pause in my life where I'm one-on-one
Right.
with Christ.
right.
I don't know if that's right or wrong.
No, that is part of it. But it's not all of it.
Right,
Because I'm a part of Christ too.
right,
And everybody else here is a part of Christ.
right,
And so you're also part of them.
right. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so we're a body. We're all members of the body. Just like when you sit down and you eat some food, where does all that nourishment go? Every part of you. And so when we as a body eat the one bread and drink the one cup, each member is connected with each other. And so it's me and the Lord, but it's also me and the Lord's body that's with me on that occasion. And so we've seen the first problem, which was the abuse of the poor. She talks to you about. The second problem is the abuse of the Lord, because they're despising the church of God. And so now Paul's going to give us the solution to both, which is basically found in the 3 words, discern the body. And as I was looking at this again today, I don't really like the way I worded question 17. How can a person keep from partaking in an unworthy manner? And maybe I should have said, how can a person partake in an unworthy manner? And how is the unworthy manner, so far, just in generalities, how would I partake of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner? Just from what we've talked about.
Well, I think your question is actually asking the positive.
Yes, it is.
It's asking how can we partake in a worthy manner. Is
Right.
really what you're trying to ask.
Right.
So you're actually asking the positive, and the positive is to discern the Lord's body.
Right. So an unworthy manner is going to be seen in me failing to fulfill the purpose that Jesus has for it. That's where it becomes. Here's a reason Jesus instituted the supper. When I don't fulfill that purpose, I'm partaking of it in an unworthy manner. Okay?
But your question is still valid the way it's worded, because how do you keep from partaking in an unworthy manner? And you reference verse 28, okay? But a man must examine himself, and in so doing, is to eat the bread and drink the cup.
Right.
So that's how you keep from partaking in an unworthy manner, is make sure you're doing it right.
Right, exactly. So if I can partake of it in the way that the Lord prescribed and the purpose, then I'm going to succeed. That's a simple answer. But the more complex answer is seen in the judgment language that Paul uses here as it follows through. When the Corinthians ate the supper as they had been doing, as seen in verse 20 through 22, when you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper you're eating, for as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat in, etc. So he begins verse 27 with, therefore. And in light of what he's just said about the meaning of the words of the institution of the supper, when Jesus gave them, he now moves to their abuse. And instead of proclaiming their salvation, they're actually becoming liable for the death of Christ. He talks about the fact here, whenever you eat the bread or drink the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner, you're going to be guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of Christ. And which brings us to the words back, unworthy manner. The Greek word is anaxios, A-N-A-X-I-O-S. It actually means without balance. Without balance. And so, and again, it's not talking about the person individually who's doing the eating here. It speaks of the manner in which it's done. And this was huge for me, because it's not talking about how I break the bread off and drink the cup and what I think about with regard to that specifically, but it's the manner in which I'm doing it. The bread and the cup together is the Lord's Supper as a unit, a whole. And if I don't partake of that in a manner if I partake of it in a manner that's unworthy, then I'm guilty of sinning against the Lord. And liable to his death, and basically is what he's saying. Mike?
You said it wasn't just how you broke the bread or picked up the cup or whatever, but is it talking in a manner? Is it the attitude? Is it what you're examining is not how I physically did it, it's how am I responding to Christ
Right.
in this time? And when we examine ourselves, I'm kind of leaning now that the examining yourself is to make sure you're in the right spot, that your attitudes and things are right as you examine the body. So the goal is not necessarily to examine myself, it's to make sure that I'm in the right spot so that when I consider the body, I'm doing it correctly.
Okay. I'm going to we'll come back to the beginning of 17 as we go through this. But what I want you to think about in the meantime is, what was the attitude of the people who put Jesus to death? Because that same attitude is being manifested here by the Corinthians, as was manifested by the Jews when they crucified Christ. And I think that that's the key to understanding the manner here. John?
I'm reminded of Jesus saying, if any of you is bringing a gift to the altar and on your way remembers that your brother has something against you, go and correct that,
Right?
and then continue with your gift.
Right. Right. And so that has all of that's all together. I mean, it's not, we can't just look at, okay, here comes the bread and I have to think about a particular thing while I'm eating the bread, and here comes the cup and I have to think about a particular thing without seeing the whole picture here. And we're going to have to, again, focus on what was going on here in Corinth, because that's who he's dealing with, and then we can extrapolate out if there's parallels that we can see in our own lives. But the manner in which they're doing this is so un-Christ-like that that's what he's dealing with them. All right.